In 1871, Charles Darwin published a book that shouldn't have existed. Not because his ideas were wrong, but because he had absolutely no proof. He had never set foot in Africa. He had never held a human fossil in his hands, because at the time, no one had found a single one. The only known human remains were the Neanderthal bones discovered in Germany in 1856. Europe, it seemed, was the center of everything, and yet, Darwin wrote with a calmness that was almost irritating to his contemporaries. It is probable that Africa is the cradle of humanity. He wasn't certain. He didn't claim to be. He said it's probable. He used that word carefully in a short paragraph, almost in passing. A footnote in the history of ideas, and then he moved on. The reason for this prediction is of a baffling elegance. Darwin looked around him. He searched for the animals closest to humans. He found the chimpanzees, he found the gorillas, and he simply noticed, without equipment, without technology, without a laboratory, that they were both African. That the great apes most similar to us are found nowhere else on Earth but on that continent. He drew the most sober conclusion possible. If our closest cousins are African, our common ancestor probably was too, and therefore, so are we, that's it. That is the entire reasoning. No DNA, no radiocarbon dating, no genomic sequencing. Just the observation that living species leave clues about dead ones. That biological kinship draws a geography of origin. Looking around in the present can tell you something true about a past you cannot see. Today you might find this idea obvious, almost trivial. In 1871 it was radical, and no one believed him. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. The United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, South Africa, or anywhere else in the English-speaking world. Let me know in the comments. I am genuinely curious to see from how many corners of the globe this voice is traveling tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. A lot is going to happen in the next few hours. A question to start us off. Before listening to this, did you think human origins were a settled, tidy story where we already knew all the broad strokes? Or did you have the feeling that something was still missing, something they hadn't told you? Tell me in the comments, because if that feeling is there, it was right. The scientific community of the late 19th century had other ideas. Asia was the heavy favorite. Ernst Haeckel, an influential German biologist, had theorized the existence of a hypothetical human ancestor he named Pithecanthropus allelus, the speechless ape man, and he placed him in Southeast Asia. In 1891, the Dutch military doctor Eugène Dubois sailed to Java with the absolute conviction that he would find human origins there. He found something, a flattened skull and a femur that he named Pithecanthropus erectus, which we know today as Homo erectus. It wasn't a direct ancestor of modern humans, but at the time it seemed to confirm that Asia was the right answer. Africa was too remote, too primitive in the colonial mindset of the era, to be the cradle of something as grand as humanity. This resistance wasn't just scientific. It was cultural, it was political. It carried the weight of the prejudices of an age that struggled to accept that the most colonized continent on the planet was also the one we all came from. Darwin had died in 1882. He didn't live to see what would happen next. It took until 1924. An autumn morning in Johannesburg, which is spring in the southern hemisphere. The heat was still mild, the sky still white. A 31-year-old Australian anatomist received a crate of fossils from a limestone quarry in a dusty town called Taung in South Africa. The crate arrived at his house at a particularly inconvenient time. Raymond Dart was getting dressed for a wedding. He was the best man. The groom was waiting. He opened the crate anyway. He pulled out the bones one by one, examining them, and right there, in his apartment, with his formal jacket half buttoned, his hands still dusty from the limestone fragments, he realized he was holding something no one had ever held before. A child's skull with a face, with a jaw, with a cranial cavity large enough to pour plaster into and make a mold of the brain. A child that was neither human nor ape. A child that was something in between. His wife walked into the room. She told him to get dressed. The groom really was waiting. Dart put the skull down, buttoned his jacket, and went to the wedding. But through the entire ceremony, the reception, the rest of that day, he thought of that face in the box. 2 weeks later he published his findings in Nature. He named the creature Australopithecus africanus, the southern ape of Africa. He stated, with a precision that bordered on audacity, that this was a human ancestor, a being that walked upright, that lived millions of years ago in Africa, exactly as Darwin had predicted. The response from the international scientific community was almost unanimous. No, Arthur Keith, one of the most respected paleoanthropologists in England, declared that the taung child was nothing more than a young chimpanzee. Grafton Elliott Smith, another great authority, wrote that Dart had vastly overestimated the specimen's importance. The consensus was brutal. Dart was young, inexperienced, probably too enthusiastic. The real discovery about human origins would come from somewhere else. And then came the most enduring humiliation. Since 1912, the Piltdown skull, found in England, had been accepted by the scientific community as the missing link between apes and humans. It had a large brain case and an ape-like jaw, exactly what the era expected from a human ancestor. A large brain came first before everything else. The taung child had a small skull and a rather human-like jaw. It was entirely backward compared to what people believed, so Dart was obviously wrong. What no one knew yet in 1924 was that the Piltdown skull was a fake, a fraudulent assembly of a modern human skull and an orangutan jaw, expertly stained to look ancient. The hoax wouldn't be exposed until 1953. For nearly 40 years, British paleoanthropology would be organized around a lie. Dart, meanwhile, kept the taung child in a box in his office, waiting. What is fascinating about this story is what it says about how science moves forward. It wasn't that the proof was missing. It was that the proof didn't match what people wanted to see. Darwin was right in 1871. Dart was right in 1924. But being right isn't enough if the mental map of the people listening to you can't yet accommodate what you're showing them. It would take other fossils, other researchers, other decades in the field. It would take Asia disappointing them. It would take Africa continuing to yield its secrets one by one, each secret older than the last. And it would ultimately take genetics arriving to say what the bones couldn't quite say on their own. Every living human on Earth carries in their cells the biological signature of a single continent. That continent is Africa. Darwin wrote it down in 1871. He just couldn't prove what he already knew. There is something unsettling in this sequence, in the fact that such a fundamental truth about our species was articulated correctly 150 years before it could be fully demonstrated, as if certain ideas arrive ahead of their time, waiting patiently in the text for the world to catch up. Darwin had looked at the chimpanzees and the gorillas. He had said, "We come from there." For half a century, no one wanted to hear it. And then Africa started speaking, and it never stopped. Tonight you are lying in the dark, somewhere in the English-speaking world. And the thought I want you to keep with you from this first part of our journey is this. Human history didn't begin when we decided to look for it in Africa. It began long before. What we searched for and found was the courage to look in the right place. Darwin had that courage. He paid for it with uncertainty. He said probable when everything around him said impossible. And that honesty, that precision, is perhaps also something we inherited from somewhere very ancient. The ability to look the evidence in the face, even when it tells us something uncomfortable. The ocean is sleeping outside somewhere. The cities are turning off one by one, and the story continues. Between the idea and the proof, there is sometimes half a century. The next piece of the puzzle was waiting in a box in a Johannesburg apartment on a morning when someone was getting dressed for a wedding. That box received on a wedding day, and the 20 years that no one wanted to listen. That box in Dart's apartment was still there the day after the wedding. It was still there a week later. And the child inside waited, just as it had waited for almost 3 million years. Here is what Raymond Dart saw when he examined this fossil closely in the days following its arrival. He saw a child's face, a face with round eye sockets, a jaw still lined with baby teeth, and a few adult teeth just beginning to emerge. He could estimate the age at about 3 years old. He could see, and this was crucial, the position of the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord meets the brain. In quadrupeds, this hole is positioned toward the back. In humans, it is underneath, and in the taung child, it was clearly underneath. This child walked upright. Dart saw it immediately. He poured plaster into the brain case to obtain an endocast, a negative mold of the brain. And what he got looked like something between the brain of a chimpanzee and the brain of a human. Larger in proportion to the body than you would expect for an ape, smaller than ours. Something in between. He spent 73 days delicately freeing the fossil from the limestone, using his own stone-carving tools and his wife Dora's knitting needles. 73 days, millimeter by millimeter. During all that time, he took notes, he thought, he wrote, and then he published. The article appeared in Nature on February 7, 1925. It was titled simply Australopithecus africanus, the man-ape of South Africa. Dart asserted that this specimen represented a human ancestor, an intermediate between the great apes and Homo sapiens, that it lived in South Africa, that it walked upright, and that Africa was, just as Darwin had predicted, the cradle of humanity. The international response arrived within weeks, and it was devastating. Imagine the scene. You are a young researcher at a university in South Africa, thousands of miles away from the great museums, the prestigious journals, the big names. You are 31 years old. You publish a discovery in Nature that challenges 50 years of paleoanthropological certainty. and the men who hold authority in your field, the English, the Germans, and the Americans, essentially tell you that you didn't understand what you were holding in your hands. Arthur Keith, conservator at the Royal College of Surgeons in London, wrote that the taung child presented all the characteristics of a young anthropoid and none of the characteristics of a human ancestor. Grafton Elliott Smith declared that the brain, despite its curious appearance, was fundamentally that of an ape. D.M.S. Watson, a renowned zoologist, believed Dart had been misled by his own imagination. None of them made the trip to examine the fossil. None of them held the taung child in their hands. They read the article, looked at the photographs, and decided from their London offices that Dart was wrong. This wasn't solely scientific arrogance, though scientific arrogance is a very real ingredient in this story. There was also a structural reason why the community couldn't hear Dart, and that reason was called Piltdown. Since 1912, displayed in the glass cases of the Natural History Museum in London, was what passed for the greatest treasure of British paleoanthropology, the Piltdown skull, found in a gravel pit in Sussex. Described by the lawyer and amateur paleontologist Charles Darwin, it seemed to represent exactly what evolutionary theory demanded: an intermediate being between ape and human, with a voluminous, almost human brain case and a jaw that was still simian. Brain first, body second. That was the logical order. The taung child was the exact opposite. A small brain, a body that walked upright. Body before brain. It didn't fit the blueprint. What no one knew yet was that the Piltdown skull was an elaborate hoax. A modern human skull stained with iron oxide to look ancient. An orangutan jaw filed down to hide the distinct characteristics of the species. The whole thing carefully assembled, buried in the right stratigraphic layer, discovered at the perfect moment. The fraud wouldn't be revealed until 1953, thanks to fluorine dating techniques. Its probable author remains debated. Some suspect Dawson himself, others point to more surprising names, but for 40 years Piltdown was reality, and in that reality Dart had no place. There is something almost comical about this situation. Comical and painful all at once. A real African fossil ignored because a fake English fossil dominated everyone's mind. If you wanted to write this story as a satire, you couldn't do it any better. Dart put the taung child away in his office. He kept teaching anatomy. He kept thinking. He didn't second-guess himself, because he had examined the fossil up close, because he knew what he had seen, because the position of the foramen magnum does not lie. But he was alone, or nearly so. There was one man in Scotland who believed him. Robert Broom was a paleontologist, a doctor, and an unclassifiable researcher. He was in his 60s when he made the journey to Johannesburg to see the taung child. He held it in his hands, examined it, and told Dart, "You are right." Broom would spend the following decade searching for other Australopithecines in South Africa. He found them in the limestone caves of Sterkfontein, Kromdraai, and Swartkrans. He published, he accumulated the proof. He too was challenged, sometimes mocked for his unorthodox excavation methods, but the fossils kept piling up. In 1936, Broom discovered the first adult Australopithecus skull at Sterkfontein. In 1947, he found a nearly complete adult skull, a female who would be nicknamed Mrs. Plez, and the world slowly began to understand that Dart had been right all along. The question then becomes, why did it take so long? That question is more interesting than it seems because it doesn't have a simple answer. There is intellectual resistance, confirmation bias, and the tendency to see in the data what we want to see. There is institutional resistance. The major journals, the great museums, the big research grants were all concentrated in Europe, and African paleoanthropology simply didn't have the resources to assert itself. There is cultural resistance. The idea that colonized, exploited Africa, considered backward by the European gaze of the time, could be the cradle of human civilization was an idea that many were simply not ready to accept. And then there is Piltdown, that extraordinarily unfortunate coincidence that at the exact moment the real African proof surfaced, a fake English proof was taking up all the oxygen in the room. There is a word to describe what Dart lived through during those years. That word is patience. A patience that wasn't serene, that must have cost him, that must have hurt, but that refused to yield. He had held that skull in his hands. He knew what he had seen, and the bones didn't tell him he was wrong. What the taung child tells us today, beyond the scientific quarrels of the interwar period, is something much more fundamental. It tells us that evolution doesn't follow a linear blueprint of becoming increasingly human. It tells us that bipedalism arrived before the large brain, that our ancestors walked upright for millions of years before possessing the kind of cognition we associate with humanity, that the body preceded the mind in a sense. That changes the question. We no longer ask, when did we start thinking? We ask, stand up first. What did walking on two legs in the African landscapes of 3 million years ago allow you To do that walking on 4 legs didn't? We will come back to these questions. For now, it is enough to know that the taung child triggered all of them. A 3-year-old child, dead for almost 3 million years in a dusty South African quarry, found by accident, placed in a crate, opened on a wedding day, and tucked away in an office for 20 years, waiting for the world to be ready. There is something in that image. A child waiting to be recognized. It doesn't leave me easily. We all carry something very ancient, something waiting in a box or in a bone or in a cell to finally be seen. The night is advancing somewhere, but the air is a little cooler than it was. Thoughts are slowing down. There was a child in a box, and someone had the courage to say what he saw. Let that image sit with you for a moment. Dart's box had proven that our ancestors walked upright before having a large brain. The next question, the real question, was, how long before? And it was in the Ethiopian desert, on an impossibly hot morning, that an answer was about to emerge. Donald Johanson didn't want to go out that morning. It was November 24, 1974. The Hadar excavation site in the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia was a bowl of red dust and rock on the edge of a dry riverbed. The temperature was already over 95 degrees at 9 in the morning, and it was still climbing. Johanson had notes to write up, paperwork to finish. He was young, 31, but the dry season digs stretched over exhausting weeks, and on that particular day, he just wanted to stay at camp. Tom Gray, his doctoral student, came to get him. Come on, one last reconnaissance, just to map an area they hadn't covered yet. An hour, maybe 2. Johanson sighed, and he went with Gray. They walked through the white heat, taking GPS coordinates, noting geological markers. Fieldwork in paleoanthropological sites often looks exactly like this, a slow, systematic progression, eyes cast down in a landscape that surrenders nothing easily. Around 11 in the morning, they decided to head back. And right there, on the slope of a shallow ravine, Johanson saw something. A tiny fragment of bone, barely visible in the sediment. He crouched down. He looked. He said to Gray in a low voice, as if the sound itself might break something, "That's a hominid." Gray looked. Gray said, "Are you sure?" Johanson said, "Look at the curvature. Look at the size. It's a hominid." They didn't touch anything. They marked the area. They practically ran all the way back to camp in the blistering heat. The 2 weeks that followed would be the most intense of Johanson's life. The entire team, every single day, on their knees in the dust and the pebbles, sifting through every square inch of that slope. They found other fragments, then more. Ribs, vertebrae, a piece of a jaw, a femur, a fragment of a pelvis, bones from a foot. When they were finished, they had reconstructed about 40% of a complete skeleton. 40%. That is extraordinary for a fossil of that antiquity. Never before had anyone found so much of a single hominid individual over 1 million years old. That night, back at camp, someone put on a cassette tape. The Beatles, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. The song played on a loop, and someone said, "Let's call her Lucy." Lucy lived 3.2 million years ago. She stood about 3.5 feet tall. She probably weighed between 55 and 65 pounds. She had a small brain, barely larger than that of a modern chimpanzee, about 400 cubic centimeters compared to our average of 1,400. She had a prominent face, no distinct chin, and relatively long arms compared to her legs, and she walked upright. That was the conclusion that changed everything, because 3.2 million years is almost 1 million years older than what the scientific community thought. They could attribute to bipedalism, and above all, Lucy had a very small brain. She had already been walking upright for a very long time. It wasn't the large brain that came first and freed the hands to allow for walking upright. It was walking upright that came first, long before cranial expansion. The order in which we imagined our evolution was backward. Dart had sensed it with the taung child. Lucy proved it irrefutably. Imagine what walking upright meant in the African landscapes of 3 million years ago. You stand up. Your hands are freed. You can carry something. You can reach what is high up. You can see over the tall grass, spot incoming danger, or track prey, or recognize a familiar face from a distance. You move slower than a sprinting quadruped, but over long distances, in the dead of the African heat, you are far more efficient. Your body sweats better, your brain stays cooler, but you pay a price. Giving birth while upright is a dangerous endeavor. The human pelvis, remodeled for bipedal walking, became narrow in all the wrong places. Human births are the most difficult of all primates. Human babies are born immature, completely unable to move on their own for months, even years, far longer than the infants of other species. This meant that hominid mothers needed help, that community, cooperation, and social solidarity were suddenly survival factors, just as important as speed or strength. Lucy had a pelvis that tells this exact story. The bones of her pelvis became, in the analyses that followed her discovery, a fundamental document on how bipedalism transformed not just our locomotion, but our entire social life. She is a fossil, but she is also a biography of the species. There is a detail in the discovery of Lucy that I want you to hold on to. Johansen shouldn't have been there that morning. He had notes to write. Gray had to convince him. They had decided to head back to camp when the heat became unbearable, and it was at that exact moment, turning around to leave, that Johansen saw the bone fragment. One of the most important discoveries in the history of paleoanthropology happened in the final second before someone gave up. That is almost a rule in this field. The great discoveries happen when you are exhausted, when you are hot, when you want to go home, and you take one last detour anyway. That's not romanticizing it. It's a statistical reality of fieldwork. You spend weeks finding nothing, and then you see something on a slope at 11 in the morning in 100-degree heat. Johansen recognized the fragment because he had spent years learning how to see, not just to look, but to see. To distinguish the curvature of a hominid bone from the curvature of a rock. The size, the angle, the texture. That recognition wasn't miraculous. It was the accumulated competence of someone who had spent thousands of hours looking at bones. And perhaps there is a lesson there that is more universal than paleoanthropology. Great recognitions come to those who have learned how to see, not to those who merely get lucky. Lucy wasn't alone. In 1975, Johansen's team returned to Hadar and made an even more extraordinary discovery. The remains of at least 13 individuals, men, women, and children, in the exact same location, in the same stratigraphic layer. They would call them the first family. Perhaps they died together in a flash flood. Perhaps they lived together in a structured social group. Together, social, organized. 3 million years before us, hominids were moving in groups, taking care of one another, living in relationships durable enough to die together. That detail right there. Not the brain, not the tools, not fire. That social detail is perhaps the most important of all, because it tells us that we have always needed one another. That solidarity is not some recent acquisition of civilization. It is something much older than civilization. It is perhaps the very first thing we ever were. Lucy's Amharic name in the official language of Ethiopia is Dinkinesh. The word means, "You are marvelous." It isn't a scientific name. It's what the Ethiopians said when they learned what she was, what the people around her felt when they heard the story. Ah, you are marvelous. 3 million years in the rock, found by chance on a morning that was too hot, by someone who almost stayed back at camp, and the whole world, when they heard about her, said, "Ah, so that's how it was." So we've been walking upright for that long. So we gathered together. So we were already something marvelous. The night is deeper now. Your body is relaxing. That little skeleton in the Ethiopian dust, those fragments of ribs, that jaw, that femur. Within her there is more time than the human mind can truly grasp, 3.2 million years. To give you a sense of scale, if you compressed all that time into a single 12-hour night, the pyramids of Giza would appear in the very last seconds before dawn. Lucy has been walking since the beginning of the night. We arrive right at the very end. Let that idea carry you gently toward what comes next. Lucy had walked through a landscape that was transforming all around her without her knowing it. The forests were retreating. The open spaces were widening. The earth itself was fracturing beneath her feet. That changing landscape wasn't just a backdrop. It was the engine. It is time to look at the machine. When the earth itself began to build a laboratory, about 10 million years ago, something began to tear apart beneath Africa, slowly, imperceptibly on the scale of a human life, a century or a millennium, but inexorably on the scale of geological time. 2 tectonic plates pulling apart along a fracture over 3,000 miles long, running from the Red Sea down to Mozambique, cutting through Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, and Malawi, the East African Rift Valley. It isn't a valley in the ordinary sense of the word. It is a collapse of the Earth's crust, a tectonic trench sometimes dozens of miles wide, flanked by sheer cliffs, dotted with deep lakes, and bristling with active volcanoes. Even today, the Somali plate continues to slowly pull away from the Nubian plate at a rate of about half an inch per year. In a few million years, if we can afford to take that perspective, a part of the Horn of Africa will break off from the continent, creating a new ocean right where plains and savannas used to be. But let's go back to 5 million years ago. Let's return to the moment when this fracture started having biological consequences. Imagine you are in East Africa, 5 million years ago. You are a primate. West and Central Africa are covered in dense, humid forests, the ancestors of what will become the Congo Basin. These forests feed the ancestors of chimpanzees and gorillas, who live in the trees, gather fruit, and have no need to change. In the East, plate tectonics changed everything. The gradual uplifting of the rift plateaus created what geologists sometimes call the Wall of Africa, a rampart of high ground that blocked the moisture-laden winds coming from the Atlantic Ocean before they could reach the eastern side of the continent. To the west of the rift, Rainforests, dense vegetation, to the east of the rift, drier, more open, more variable. The forests in the east retreated, spaces opened up, the landscape fragmented into islands of vegetation separated by grassy expanses. And the primates that lived in those forests suddenly found themselves facing a choice. A choice we can't really call a choice, because they had no conscious awareness they were making it. The trees were thinning out. Resources were becoming unpredictable. Survival depended on the ability to cross open spaces, to reach the next island of vegetation, to exploit diversified resources. Those who adapted left descendants. Those who did not adapt left nothing. The Rift Valley is a laboratory, but it's a laboratory that was never designed to produce humans. It simply created conditions that nothing else on Earth, brought together at the same time to the same degree over the same duration. First, the fragmentation of the landscape. Lakes, volcanoes, cliffs, plains, gallery forests along the rivers, open grasslands, arid zones, all of this within a radius of a few hundred miles. This fragmentation created distinct ecological niches where primate populations were sometimes isolated and sometimes reconnected. Isolation favors genetic divergence. Reconnection favors exchange. That is exactly the engine of speciation. Second, volcanism. Eruptions deposited layers of ash and tephra that stacked up in the soil like the pages of a book. These layers can be dated with precision. They contain minerals whose residual radioactivity can be measured, which means that fossils caught between two volcanic layers can also be dated with remarkable accuracy. Without the volcanism of the rift, we would have no reliable timeline of human evolution. African fossils can be dated because the African earth burned. Third, sedimentation. The rift lakes accumulate fine sediments that preserve bones with exceptional efficiency. Lake Turkana in Kenya, Lake Baringo, Lake Natron in Tanzania, their shores and ancient deltas are littered with hominid fossils because the animals came there to drink, died there, and were rapidly covered by protective sediments. The Rift Valley preserved its own archives. It made them datable, and its ecological and climatic conditions simultaneously forced unprecedented evolutionary pressures. It is in this context that we have to understand something essential. The other continents were not devoid of primates. Asia had gibbons, orangutans, macaques. Miocene Europe had dozens of species of hominoids. 15 million years ago, the European and Asian forests were teeming with great apes of all kinds. Some researchers have even suggested that the ancestors of African great apes and humans might have partially evolved in Europe before migrating back to Africa, an idea that remains highly debated. But none of those continents had the combination. The tectonic rift, the landscape fragmentation, the extreme and repeated climatic variation over millions of years, the exceptional fossil preservation, the geography that combined forest refuges with constantly shifting open spaces. East Africa was the only place on Earth where all these conditions met simultaneously, and for periods long enough for evolution to do its work, and it is no coincidence if the fossils confirm this. Not only do all known Australopithecus specimens come from Africa, but so do the first species of the genus Homo, Homo habilis, Homo ergaster. The precursors to everything that followed are all African. The rift wasn't the only possible cradle in a world where all continents were equal. It was the only actual cradle in a world where conditions mattered. There is something dizzying in realizing that we are, in part, the product of a geological catastrophe. That if the tectonic plates hadn't pulled apart along that particular line, if the East African plateau hadn't uplifted in that particular way, if the forest hadn't retreated in that exact place at that exact time, then the pressures that forged our bipedalism, our intelligence, our sociality, those pressures might never have existed in that way. It's almost comical when you think about it, that we owe the essence of our humanity to geology. Not to a grand plan, not to a direction, to drifting plates, to magmatic heat rising from the interior of the earth, to volcanoes spitting ash onto bones waiting to be found. Human dignity and plate tectonics, we never saw that association coming. Today, when you fly over the region, you can see the rift with the naked eye. That scar in the earth, that trench running north to south, flanked by fault lines and lakes stretched out like teardrops. Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi, Lake Turkana with its alkaline green waters. And on the shores of those lakes, in sediments deposited millions of years ago, bones are still waiting for Kenyan, Ethiopian, Tanzanian, and Zambian researchers, with their sieves and their brushes, down on their knees in the red dust, still searching. Every year something new emerges, a jaw fragment that pushes back the date of a species, a skull that complicates the family tree, a tooth that says someone was here, in this era, in this landscape that no longer exists. The Rift Valley is simultaneously an archive and an active mystery. It created the conditions that produced us, and it is still telling us how. The night has deepened a little more. Your body begins to feel a gentle heaviness. In a geological fault line somewhere in East Africa, a bone fragment might be slowly rising to the surface right now under the effects of erosion. Millimeter by millimeter, season after season. In a few years, or a few decades, someone will spot it on the slope of a ravine, and we will learn something new about ourselves. The Rift Valley had fractured the landscape and changed the climate, but that landscape, open savanna, dense forest, arid plains, our ancestors didn't just inhabit one version of it, they lived on the borderlines between them all, and it was those borders, not the open spaces, that started everything. Why we are not savanna apes. There is an image everyone has in mind when we talk about human origins. A distant ancestor, hairy, hunched over, cautious, stepping out of a forest for the very first time. Before him, the savanna stretches all the way to the horizon. Tall grass, immense sky, beating sun. He stands up tall, looks into the distance, and something inside him shifts. It is the founding moment. The savanna as a baptism. It is a beautiful image. It is also probably wrong. Not entirely. The savanna played a role, but the idea that our ancestors left the forest, found themselves in the savanna, and became human in that open space. It is a simplification that guided paleoanthropology for decades, and that the accumulated evidence contradicts more and more clearly. When researchers analyze the environments in which hominid fossils have been found looking at the types of pollen in the same sedimentary layers, the associated animal species, the carbon isotopes in the soil, what they see is not a pure and simple savanna. What they see is a mosaic. Wooded areas, grassy zones, edges of gallery forests along rivers and lakes, transition zones between habitats, and strikingly, hominid fossils are most often concentrated in these transition zones. Not deep in the open savanna, not deep in the dense forest, but right at the interface. A study published in Science in 2023, examining the living environments of early hominids, is particularly clear on this. Point, our ancestors were not specialists of a single habitat. They were generalists of the borderlands. They lived where two types of environments met, where food resources were the most diverse, where narrow specialization was impossible, because the landscape changed far too often. It wasn't the savanna that made us human. It was the absolute necessity of navigating between environments. Think about what that means in practical terms. In a dense forest, you develop adaptations for the forest. In a pure savanna, you develop adaptations for the savanna. But in a shifting landscape, where the rainy season turns a prairie into a shield of vegetation, where drought shrinks the gallery forests, where lake levels rise and fall from one decade to the next, you cannot specialize. To specialize would be a fatal mistake. What survives is whatever can do a little bit of everything. Eat just about anything, move across any terrain, adapt to the unforeseen rather than relying on predictability. And that radical versatility is perhaps the most fundamental characteristic of our species. We are the least specialized mammals on the planet in an ecological sense. A cheetah is built to run fast. A dolphin is built to swim. An eagle is built to fly. A human is built for just about anything. We aren't exceptionally great in any one particular category, but we are reasonably good at all of them. This generality is not a weakness. It is our singular strength. And it comes from millions of years in an African mosaic landscape that gave us no choice but to be exactly that. There is a researcher whose work illuminates this period in a particularly vivid way. His name is Richard Wrangham, a primatologist at Harvard. Since the 1990s, he has followed chimpanzees in the Kibale forests in Uganda to understand how primates utilize food resources in varied environments. What he observes in chimpanzees is a remarkable flexibility. They eat fruits and leaves, insects, and occasionally meat. But this flexibility has limits. Chimpanzees remain essentially forest animals. When the forest retreats, they don't easily follow it. They don't easily cross open spaces. Their occasional bipedalism isn't efficient over long distances. The Australopithecines, however, crossed that boundary. They could traverse open spaces. Not comfortably, perhaps not quickly, but they did it. And that ability to go from the tree to the plain and back again is the difference between staying in your niche and becoming something entirely new. Here is a distinctly human moment in this long history. About 3.5 million years ago, on the shores of a deep lake in Tanzania, in a place called Laetoli today, a group of hominids crossed a plain covered in fresh volcanic ash. Perhaps 3 individuals, a tall adult, a smaller adult, and a third, perhaps a child, walking directly in the footprints of the largest, placing its feet exactly where the adult had stepped. Like a child playing a game of following their parents' footsteps in the snow. These footprints were fossilized in the ash. Mary Leakey discovered them in 1976. They are considered today to be one of the most beautiful proofs of Australopithecine bipedalism and one of the most touching images paleoanthropology has ever given us. But it isn't the science I want you to remember from Laetoli. It's the child walking in the adult's footprints, That gesture, that game, is 3.5 million years old. And if you have children, or if you've had them, or if you remember being one, you know that this gesture hasn't changed. The child following the adult's steps in the snow, in the sand, in the ash. Something that endures. The savanna theory had another weakness that is important to mention, because it guided a lot of ideas about bipedalism. The idea was, our ancestors stood up to see over the tall grass, to spot predators, to gain a visual advantage in the open space. It is appealing, and perhaps partially true in certain contexts. But there is a problem. When chimpanzees cross open spaces, they stand up on their hind legs precisely to survey their environment. They practice occasional bipedalism, and yet they never became permanently bipedal. Something else had to be at play. Richard Wrangham proposed a different hypothesis, and it is fascinating. Bipedalism might have first evolved as a mode of locomotion for transporting food. Primates that could carry food in their freed arms, take it from one place to another, and share it with their partners and their young would have had a significant reproductive advantage. Bipedalism as the expression of a food-sharing network, as the infrastructure of social bonding. It is not the only hypothesis. Researchers are still debating. Perhaps bipedalism evolved for several reasons at once. In a mosaic landscape, different pressures can act simultaneously. But the idea that walking upright was first and foremost a gesture of sharing rather than a gesture of surveillance, that we stood up to hold something in our hands and carry it to someone else, is an idea that doesn't leave me easily. What the mosaic landscape ultimately tells us is that we are the product of instability, not of a stable paradise that allowed us to evolve in peace, but of a shifting, changing environment that rewarded flexibility and punished rigidity. This instability is inside us. The boredom you feel when a routine settles in for too long, the need for novelty, for variation, for different stimulation, the inability to specialize in just one single thing when you are curious about everything. That isn't a character flaw. It is an evolutionary strategy carved into your biology for millions of years in an African landscape that never stayed the same for 2 seasons in a row. You get bored easily because your ancestors couldn't afford to rest on their laurels. That slight restlessness you sometimes feel, that need to move, to change, to explore, that is the savanna inside you. It's the edge of the forest, the plain that begins right where the trees end, and the absolute certainty that something useful might just be waiting on the other side. The Litoli footprints are still there in the tufaceous ash of Tanzania, protected today by layers of sand and clay deposited by conservation teams. 3 silhouettes walking north through the ash of an eruption that had temporarily killed off all the vegetation around them. They kept going anyway. They moved forward in a momentarily devastated landscape, because that is what borderland animals do. They cross over. They look for the next edge. We are still doing the exact same thing. The night moves forward. The body grows gently heavier. The brain that didn't know how to survive, and the climatic variability that forced us to become ingenious. In this perpetually moving mosaic landscape, something was growing, not just in size, but in complexity. An organ that consumed a crazy amount of energy and seemed to have no apparent limits. Why would evolution have favored something so incredibly costly? The answer is in the weather. The human brain accounts for about 2% of body mass, yet it consumes 20% of the body's total energy. It is an extraordinarily greedy organ. A Formula One engine installed in a city car, running at full throttle 24 hours a day, even during sleep, even during this precise moment as you listen to these words in the dark. For evolution to favor something so expensive, the payoff had to be massive. The question is, what payoff? The intuitive answer is intelligence. A bigger brain thinks better. A being that thinks better survives better. It's simple, but that answer is incomplete. Because if pure intelligence were the key, you would expect brains to grow steadily and progressively in all stable environments. That is not what the fossils show. What they show is something much more interesting. The hominid brain grew in bursts, not in a linear fashion, but in leaps, separated by long periods of stasis. And those leaps coincide almost exactly with periods of extreme climatic variability in Africa. Rick Potts has worked at the Smithsonian Institution since the 1980s. He excavates primarily at Olorgesailie in Kenya, a now dry lake basin that has yielded thousands of tools and animal fossils spanning nearly 1 million years of human occupation. What Potts did, which few researchers had done before him, was overlay the paleoclimatic data onto the fossil data. He looked at the sedimentary layers, analyzed the oxygen isotopes in the carbonate rocks, precise markers of past temperatures and rainfall, and compared those climatic curves with the sudden shifts in tool assemblages and fossils. What he found led him to formulate what he calls the theory of variability selection. The central idea is this: it wasn't heat or cold or drought or humidity in particular, that selected for human intelligence. It was the oscillation between those states, the fluctuation, the chronic unpredictability. A stable environment, even a difficult one, selects for specialists. Animals adapted precisely to what exists. An environment that changes repeatedly and unpredictably cannot select for specialists, because specialization becomes a handicap the second conditions shift. What it selects for is flexibility. The ability to learn rather than rely purely on instinct. The ability to invent new solutions to entirely new problems. A larger brain isn't a universal tool. It is a tool built for the unpredictable. Ulrich Sally tells this story in a way that is almost too easy to read. For hundreds of thousands of years, the populations living around this lake made the exact same tools. Large stone hand axes, chipped according to an identical pattern, generation after generation, the Acheulean tradition, stable, efficient, passed down with no apparent variation for an almost inconceivable amount of time. Over 500,000 years of the exact same tool shape. Then, about 300,000 years ago, the lake fluctuated violently. The landscape changed radically. The large animals these populations hunted disappeared or migrated. And in the sedimentary layers following this climate rupture, the large hand axes vanished too. What replaced them is staggering in its diversity. Small obsidian tools, a volcanic rock that these populations had to fetch from dozens of miles away, implying planning, organization of travel, and perhaps trade with distant groups. Red ochre, pigments, traces of symbolic behavior. The climate crisis didn't destroy these populations. It forced them to become something else, and you carry that mechanism inside you. When everything is going well, when routine is stable, the human brain finds a way to operate with the least amount of effort possible. It is what neuroscientists call automaticity, the tendency to turn repeated behaviors into habits that consume very little cognitive energy. It's efficient, it's economical, and it is exactly what the Ulrich populations were doing for 500,000 years with their identical hand axes. But when a disruption arrives, when something no longer works, when the usual problem no longer has a usual solution, the brain lights up differently. The prefrontal cortex activates. Creativity kicks in. New connections form between areas that don't usually communicate. That ability to spark in the face of novelty, that immediate response to disruption, that is the direct inheritance of millions of years of African climate variability. When you are faced with a problem you've never encountered before, and something inside you begins searching for lateral solutions, combining ideas that don't usually go together, improvising, that is Ulrich. That is the fluctuating lake. That is the pressure that selected for this exact capability hundreds of millennia ago. There is a real and unresolved debate in this field that it would be dishonest not to mention. On one side, Potts and his supporters. Climate variability is the main driver of human encephalization. The Ulrich data is convincing. The correlations between climate oscillations and evolutionary changes are too numerous to be coincidences. On the other side, researchers like David Geary and other defenders of the social complexity theory. It wasn't the climate that selected for large brains. It was competition between human groups. Groups with better capacities for coordination, communication, and strategic planning survived groups that were less organized. Warfare, cooperation, politics, social challenges would have been more cognitively demanding than environmental ones. These two theories are not mutually exclusive. It is entirely possible, probable even, that climate variability created the initial pressures and that growing social complexity amplified those pressures as human groups became more numerous and interconnected. Both engines might have been running at the same time, mutually reinforcing each other. What is certain is that both processes unfolded in Africa, in unstable African landscapes, among African populations that traded tools, genes, and ideas across an entire continent. About 200 years ago, the exact date still shifts as new fossils emerge. African hominid brains reached something close to their current size. Not exactly like ours in their internal organization, but in their raw volume, in their comparable structural complexity. It wasn't a finish line. It was a possibility opening up. A brain of that size and complexity can do things no previous brain could do. It can imagine situations that don't yet exist. It can plan on time horizons spanning several seasons. It can represent the mental state of other individuals, understand what the other is thinking, feel what the other is feeling. It can attach arbitrary meanings to sounds, thus creating language in the fullest sense of the word. It can, in a word, tell stories. Stories about the past, stories about the future, stories about beings that don't exist in places that never existed. Stories listened to in the dark before falling asleep. Something fundamental had just become possible. The night continues. The brain behind your closed eyes, that organ consuming 20% of your energy even right now. Slow down gently. The thoughts become less sharp, the connections less urgent. It is the thing that made everything possible. This unreasonably expensive brain, shaped by fluctuating lakes and changing landscapes and pressures that left us no choice. It is yours now. It is doing what it was built to do. Listening to a story in the dark, the brain had grown. But what happened next is perhaps the most astounding part of this whole story. Not when we started thinking, but when, for the very first time, we left a trace of who we were. And that trace came from an unexpected place. A cliff in Morocco, in fossils that no one had correctly dated for 60 years. The brain had grown in the unstable landscapes of East Africa. But there is something particular about the place where the oldest faces of our species were found. And that place is not where anyone expected it to be. In June 2017, an international team led by Jean-Jacques Hublin, director of the Department of Human Evolution at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, published a study in Nature that redrew the map of human origins. The site is called Jebel Irhoud. It is a hill in northwestern Morocco, about 60 miles from Marrakech, in an arid, stony landscape that looks today much like it must have looked hundreds of millennia ago. Dry, burning, mineral. The limestone cliff at the site yielded its first fossils in the 1960s, when miners digging for barite unearthed human bones. At the time, they were poorly dated, estimated at about 40,000 years old, and filed away in an ambiguous category. Not quite Homo sapiens, not quite archaic. For 50 years, Jebel Irhoud lingered in an uncomfortable scientific limbo. Hublin returned there in 2004. He methodically resumed the excavations, extracted new fossils, and applied modern dating techniques. Thermoluminescence on burnt flints found in the exact same layers as the bones. The result made him, by his own admission, double-check his calculations. 315,000 years, not 40,000. 315,000, with a margin of error of 34, 0 years in either direction. Our species is 100 millennia older than the scientific community thought. The fossils of Jebel Irhoud belong to at least 5 individuals, adults, adolescents, and at least 1 child. Their faces are surprisingly modern. Low, flat, lacking the massive supraorbital ridge of archaic species. If you passed one of these faces on the street, you would probably recognize them as human. It is the face of a someone, but the back of their skull is still elongated, closer to archaic forms. The brain was there, comparable in size to ours, but its internal organization, its precise shape, was still in the process of becoming what it would become. They are Homo sapiens in the phylogenetic sense, in our direct lineage, clearly distinct from all cousin species. But they are Homo sapiens who were still putting the final pieces together. Hublin describes them as humans in the process of modernizing. What changes radically with Jebel Irhoud isn't just the date, it is the geography. Jebel Irhoud is in Morocco, in North Africa, thousands of miles away from the Ethiopian Rift Valley that the scientific community had long considered the exclusive cradle of Homo sapiens. The same year as Hublin's publication, other studies re-evaluated fossils from Florisbad in South Africa, dating them to about 260,000 years ago, confirming that Proto-sapiens populations existed simultaneously in the north and in the south of the continent. What this suggests is staggering. Homo sapiens was not born in a single place. We didn't emerge in a single valley, in a single population. At a single moment, we emerged across an entire continent. Populations dispersed over millions of square miles, evolving in parallel, reconnecting intermittently, exchanging genes and perhaps behaviors, and gradually converging towards something cohesive. An entire continent acting as a crucible. Not a valley. A continent. There is something important to grasp here, something that resists our intuition. When we say that Homo sapiens emerged in Africa, we often imagine a small, isolated population. A few hundred individuals in a specific valley who developed modern traits and then spread out from there. That model says, there was a center, a point of origin, a first group. The model that current evidence supports is different. It isn't a point, it's a network. Populations scattered across Africa, in the forests of the Congo, in the savannas of Kenya, on the coastlines of Morocco and South Africa, who were genetically close enough to interbreed when they met, but geographically separated enough to evolve in slightly distinct ways between those meetings. Every encounter mixed their genes. Every separation allowed for local divergence. The repetition of this cycle over hundreds of millennia produced a species of unprecedented genetic and behavioral complexity. This idea has a scientific name, the weakly structured stem model. In everyday English, you could call it a braided river. Not a tree with a single root, a delta. Channels that separate and rejoin over and over again across the entire continent, and it was in Africa, and only in Africa, that this network was dense enough, active enough, and ancient enough to produce this result. There is a detail in the excavations of Jebel Irhoud that moves me particularly. In the same layer as the human fossils, Hublin and his team found chipped flints, Middle Paleolithic tools carefully crafted, and some of these flints bear the marks of being heated. They were heated in a fire before being knapped, a technique that makes the stone easier to shape, which requires foresight, planning, and knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. Over 300,000 years before us, at the foot of a cliff in what is today Morocco, someone was heating flints in a fire to prepare their tools for the next day. He or she knew exactly what they were doing. They had learned it from someone else, and they were going to pass that knowledge on. That is perhaps the simplest and most complete definition of what we are: beings who pass on what they have learned. Since then, the model of African origins has become even more complex. Fossils discovered in Ethiopia at Omo Kibish have been redated to about 230,000 years ago. Behavioral traces in South African caves trace back to 200,000 years, then to 164,000 years. Fossilized footprints in South Africa dating to 115,000 years. Every year the map grows richer, more complicated, more honest. What we know for certain is this: anatomically modern humans have existed in Africa for at least 315,000 years. They do not exist anywhere else in the world until about 100,000 to 60,000 years ago. And even then, the early migrations into the Near East seem to have failed to establish a permanent foothold. The world outside of Africa remained without permanent Homo sapiens for the vast majority of our existence as a species. Africa was our world. For a long time it was almost entirely so. The night has deepened around you. Somewhere in Morocco, in a limestone hill 60 miles from Marrakech, there are layers of sediment that still hold secrets no one has unearthed yet. Bones, tools, fires extinguished for 300,000 years. Waiting as they have always waited. The faces of Jebel Irhoud looked out toward a horizon we cannot imagine. But what Morocco could not yet tell us is what a small laboratory in Berkeley was about to reveal in 1987. Not from stones, but from the living cells of 147 ordinary people from 5 corners of the world. What Morocco couldn't yet say in 2017, nor in 1987, was what a small laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, had already begun to reveal. Not from stones and bones, but from the living cells of 147 ordinary people from 5 corners of the world. In 1987, Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson published a groundbreaking article in Nature that would make headlines around the world, and generate a scientific controversy that would last for years. Their method was relatively simple in principle, but revolutionary in its implications. They had collected samples of mitochondrial DNA, the DNA found not in the nucleus of cells, but in the mitochondria, the organelles that produce cellular energy, from 147 people of African, European, Asian, Australian, and Melanesian descent. They compared these sequences to one another, measured their differences, and built a phylogenetic tree, a family tree, tracing back to the common root of all these lineages. That root pointed to Africa, and it was dated, using the known mutation rate of mitochondrial DNA as a molecular clock, to about 200,000 years ago. The press immediately dubbed this ancestor African Eve, and that is where the misunderstandings began. Mitochondrial Eve was not the first woman. She wasn't the only woman alive at her time. She wasn't alone. She lived in a population of perhaps several thousand individuals, men and women, many of whom also have living descendants today. What she is technically is this: she is the most recent woman from whom all current mitochondrial lineages descend. In simpler terms, all the women living at the same time as her also had children, and those children had children. But over the generations, certain mitochondrial lineages died out. Not because those women didn't have descendants, but because in certain generations they only had sons. And mitochondrial DNA is passed on exclusively by mothers. Those specific lineages vanished from the mitochondrial circulation, even if their carriers still have descendants today. This process is called genetic drift. It is statistically inevitable that in any finite population, all mitochondrial lineages will converge on a common ancestor if you go far enough back in time. What the study by Cann, Stoneking, and Wilson showed is that this convergence for modern humans points to Africa, and to a period around 200,000 years ago. This doesn't prove that all of humanity descends from a single woman at a single moment. It proves that all current maternal lineages converge on a common African ancestor around that approximate time. That is different, and it is still extraordinary. Alan Wilson died of leukemia in 1991, 4 years after the article was published. He never got to see what came next. The massive genomic confirmation of the 2000s and 2010s that would validate the core of his conclusions while adding nuance to them. Rebecca Cann is still alive and active. In an interview given years after the publication, she said something that stays with me. She said, "What matters isn't that we all descend from a single woman. It's that we all descend from Africa. That is the information. The woman is a useful metaphor. Africa is a fact. What mitochondrial genetics has established since then, with tools vastly more powerful than those of 1987, is a coherent and convergent picture. Human genetic diversity is at its absolute maximum in sub-Saharan Africa. African populations contain, all on their own, more genetic variation than all non-African populations combined. This is easily explained if all current human diversity outside of Africa derives from a subset of African diversity. Because the groups that migrated only took with them a fraction of the genes present in the remaining African populations, therefore current African populations are genetically the richest. They carry the entire library. The rest of us carry an excerpt. You carry in every one of your cells, in every mitochondrion of every cell in your body, an unbroken chain of transmission all the way back to that African woman who lived 200,000 years ago. It isn't a metaphor. It is a chemical reality. A sequence of nucleotides passed from mother to daughter, copied and recopied with very rare errors, from an African body all the way to yours. This transmission knows no national borders. It knows no languages. It knows no centuries. It is silent, invisible, and absolutely continuous. There is something profound to understand about what it means to be African in the context of this story. The researchers who reconstructed human migrations out of Africa estimate that the groups who left the continent about 60,000 to 70,000 years ago represented perhaps a few thousand individuals, perhaps fewer. A tiny subset of the total human population at the time, which lived primarily in Africa. Those few thousand people populated the entire globe. All of current non-African humanity, billions of people, descends from that founding group. All of its genetic diversity, European, Asian, Native American, Oceanian, is contained within what a small band of a few thousand Africans carried in their cells 60,000 years ago. It is dizzying, and it is verifiable. Every large-scale genomic study confirms the exact same pattern. The closer you are to Africa, the greater the genetic diversity. The further away you get, the more it diminishes, like the ripples of a stone thrown into water. Maximum density at the center, and increasingly sparse circles moving outward. We are all the ripples of that stone. The night is deep now. Your breathing slows down. It is in every one of your cells. Right now, millions of mitochondria are working. They are burning glucose. They are producing energy. They are doing their job without you having to think about it, without you asking, just as they have done in every human body for 200 millennia. And in their DNA, this circular, microscopic, archaic DNA, there is a story that reaches all the way back to a woman who lived in an African landscape you will never see. Under an African sky no one has seen for 200,000 years. She had no idea she would be the mother of everyone. She looked for food. She fed her children. She slept under the stars. She slept just like you are sleeping now. But while African populations were carrying this genetic wealth and continuity inside them, a catastrophe of almost inconceivable magnitude was about to bring our species to the edge of the abyss, and the humans who survived would do so from a cave overlooking the sea, eating shellfish and painting their bodies with red ochre. About 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, the Toba volcano erupted. This was no ordinary eruption. It was the largest volcanic eruption on the planet in the last 2 million years. It projected into the atmosphere an estimated 800 cubic kilometers of ash and sulfuric aerosols, an amount that blocked solar radiation for several years and triggered what researchers call a volcanic winter. Temperatures plummeted brutally, rainfall patterns shifted, forests died, herbivores disappeared or migrated. Entire food chains collapsed. For decades, the Toba catastrophe theory argued that this event had reduced the global human population to perhaps 10 dosu individuals, maybe even fewer. A genetic bottleneck, a near extinction. The reality, as current data paints it, is more nuanced and in some ways even more fascinating. Archaeological evidence in several regions of Africa shows a continuity of human occupation before and after the Toba eruption. No sharp interruption, no total erasure. What happened was something else entirely, an extraordinary adaptation under extraordinary pressure. Curtis Marion is a professor at Arizona State University. Since the 2000s, he has directed the excavations at Pinnacle Point, on the southern coast of South Africa, a few miles from the town of Mossel Bay. Pinnacle Point is a series of caves carved into a limestone cliff overlooking the Indian Ocean, or rather, the place where the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean meet at Cape Agulhas, the southernmost tip of the African continent. The waters there are cold, restless, rich in nutrients. In terms of marine resources, it is one of the most productive coastlines in all of Africa. And 164,000 years ago, during a particularly severe global glacial period that made the interior of Africa dry, cold, and difficult to inhabit, humans were living in these caves and eating what the sea offered them: mussels, limpets, sea urchins, crabs, maybe octopus. This is not an insignificant detail. The systematic consumption of seafood represents a significant cognitive and behavioral leap. Mollusks and crustaceans aren't found simply by wandering around looking. They require understanding the cycles of the tides, knowing when the intertidal zones are accessible, planning foraging trips based on lunar rhythms, developing tools to crack open hard shells. And there is more. In the same sedimentary layers as the shells, Moran and his team found something else: ore, a reddish-brown sedimentary rock, rich in iron oxide, that these humans were gathering, heating, and grinding into a powder. What was this red ochre powder used for? No one knows for sure. There are many hypotheses: skin protection against the sun and insects, an adhesive for attaching tools to handles, preserving meat and hides, and perhaps the most unsettling hypothesis of all, body decoration, symbolic marking, a signal of group identity. This last possibility is what most interests cognitive researchers, because marking your body with a colored substance to signify something to someone else, to say I belong to this group, or I am mourning, or I am an adult, is a symbolic operation. It is using a material object to represent an abstract reality. It is the exact same fundamental cognitive operation at work in writing, in painting, in language, at Pinnacle Point, 164,000 years ago. There is a moment I often imagine when thinking about Pinnacle Point. It is evening. The sun is setting over the ocean, red, vast, slow. Down in the cave, a few individuals return from the shore with nets full of mollusks. Someone tends to the fire. A woman or a man, we can't know, takes a piece of ochre and rubs it against a flat stone until it turns to powder. They mix this powder with animal fat. They spread this mixture on their skin or on the skin of someone else. The children watch. They will learn this gesture. They will pass it on. And in that transmission, in that gesture repeated from generation to generation, charged with a meaning that shifts and expands over time, something human is built that didn't exist before. Not intelligence, not language, not technology, meaning. The idea that certain gestures mean something, that certain colors want to say something, that what we do to our bodies, or to the bodies of others, speaks a language the whole group can read. The Pinnacle Point caves yielded something else, too. Tools of remarkable finesse, tiny flint flakes, what archaeologists call microliths, so small and so precisely chipped that they couldn't be used alone. They were assembled, several at a time, attached to wooden or bone handles to create composite tools. Knives, perhaps, spears, maybe, primitive arrows, composite tools, 164,000 years ago. To make a composite tool, you have to imagine the tool before you make it. You have to mentally design an assembly of different materials that, together, will do something that none of the parts can do alone. It is a thought process rooted in abstraction, a thought of the future, a thought of complexity, and it was in South Africa by the ocean, in a cave swept by the winds of Cape Agulhas, that the oldest traces of this thinking were found. The question of whether Toba really came close to extinguishing humanity remains open. Genetic data shows a significant reduction in human diversity around that period, but whether this reduction is due to Toba, or to other climatic factors from the same era, or to the migration out of Africa that followed, researchers still do not agree. What we do know is that humans were surviving at Pinnacle Point during this difficult period, and their survival wasn't passive. It wasn't simply finding a cave and waiting for it to blow over. It was an active, inventive, culturally rich adaptation that perhaps laid the behavioral foundations for everything that followed. The sea as a refuge, ochre as a language, microliths as abstract thought. It was all already there. The waves outside tonight, if you can hear them, if you can imagine them, are crashing against shores those humans never saw. But they are crashing with the exact same water, under the same sky, to the same tidal rhythm that dictated their morning trips to the shoreline. Something inside you might recognize that rhythm. The ocean hasn't changed. We are the ones who left. The humans of Pinnacle Point had survived by adapting to the sea, but the populations living simultaneously in other parts of Africa, in the forests, in the plains, in the wetlands of the continent, were forming something even more important: a network. And it is precisely this network that explains why Neanderthals, despite everything they possessed, never became us. But at the exact same time, thousands of miles to the north, in the forests and valleys of Europe and the Near East, another human species was living, hunting, burying their dead, and making tools of real sophistication, the Neanderthals. And here is the question we don't ask directly enough. They had everything they needed. Why didn't they become us? The brain of an adult Neanderthal was comparable in volume to ours. Some specimens even slightly exceeded the average brain volume of a modern Homo sapiens. They knapped tools using the Mousterian technique with impressive precision and standardization. They controlled fire. They took care of their wounded. Several Neanderthal skeletons show healed fractures that couldn't have healed without care provided by others. They buried their dead, sometimes with objects that suggest symbolic intent, although that last point remains debated. They existed for about 400,000 years. That is more than 10 times the length of all recorded human history. And yet they disappeared, partially absorbed by Homo sapiens during the migration out of Africa. We carry between 1 and 4% of their DNA, but vanished as a distinct species about 40,000 years ago. Why? The short and incomplete answer is that Homo sapiens replaced them thanks to superior intelligence. It's a satisfying answer. It is also probably inaccurate, or at the very least insufficient. Neanderthals were not stupid. The idea of the Neanderthal as a primitive brute is a caricature that was debunked decades ago. What the evidence shows is something subtler and much more interesting. The fundamental difference between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens was perhaps not a difference in individual capacity. It was a difference of scale and connectivity. Neanderthal populations were small and scattered. Estimates vary, but most demographic models suggest a total Neanderthal population in Europe and the Near East that never exceeded a few tens of thousands of individuals, perhaps far fewer. And these populations lived in groups that were relatively isolated from one another, separated by forests, mountain ranges, and winters that made travel incredibly difficult. African populations of Homo sapiens, on the other hand, were far more numerous according to genetic estimates, and they lived on a continent offering much more accessible corridors for movement. They exchanged genes, technologies, and behaviors across continental distances. This African network, this continental connectivity, had consequences we often underestimate. An innovation appearing in one African population could spread to other populations through trade and migration, a more efficient tool, a new hunting technique, a more elaborate social behavior. In a dense, connected network, a good idea travels fast. In small, isolated populations, a good idea might appear and then disappear with the group that invented it, without ever spreading. Neanderthals lived in isolated pockets. Their innovations remained local. Their remarkable Mousterian tools barely evolved over hundreds of millennia. Not because they didn't know how to innovate, but perhaps because the network required for innovation to accumulate, combine, and transform simply didn't exist at the necessary scale. African Homo sapiens had that network, and in that network innovations accumulated. Like at Pinnacle Point, like at Olorgesailie, like in dozens of African sites showing increasing behavioral complexity over a period of hundreds of millennia, there is a genetic fact that illustrates this difference in a particularly concrete way. When Homo sapiens began to move out of Africa and encounter Neanderthals, they interbred, modestly but genuinely. Non-Africans today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Some of those genes inherited from Neanderthals were kept by natural selection because they were useful. Certain immune genes, certain adaptations to the cold. But there are also regions of the human genome where Neanderthal DNA is remarkably absent. The regions linked to brain development. The regions linked to language, notably around the FOXP2 gene, which is involved in speech. It is as if, in those specific places, the Neanderthal variants were incompatible with something essential in the biology of Homo sapiens. This isn't proof that Neanderthals didn't have language. It is proof that their language, or their language-related cognition, was different enough from ours that their genetic variants weren't preserved in our lineage. A subtle difference, but perhaps a decisive one. This part of the story could end on a triumphant note. Homo sapiens winning, Neanderthals losing. The victory of African intelligence over the cousins of the North. But that version would be dishonest. Neanderthals lived for 400,000 years in some of the harshest environments the Earth has ever known. The European ice ages, with their months-long winters, their dangerous megafauna, their meager and unpredictable food resources. They survived and thrived for a span of time we haven't even come close to approaching. We, who have only existed as a species for 300,000 years. If evolutionary success is measured by duration, the Neanderthals didn't fail. It was the encounter with us that proved fatal, and that encounter wasn't inevitable. It happened because African Homo sapiens had developed, within that continental African network, something different enough to change the outcome of every encounter. Gradually, over millennia, with no decisive battle, with no clear victory, just a slow dilution, a progressive replacement, and a few % of their genes continuing to travel silently and patiently inside our bodies. The night is very deep now. The Neanderthals have been gone for 40,000 years, but they are still here, in a way, in the DNA of every non-African person listening to these words tonight. A fragment of someone who lived in the frozen forests of Europe, who napped flint by a riverbed, and who laid their dead in the earth with care. It is no small thing to be the vessel for someone else. Neanderthals didn't have that African network, that flow of exchange across an entire continent that allowed innovations to accumulate and populations to mingle, and it is precisely this network that modern genetics now allows us to see in all its complexity. Not a straight line from a single people, but a braided river across an entire continent. Neanderthals didn't have that African network. But what exactly was it? For a long time the answer seemed simple. An African population in a specific African region had developed modern traits and spread out from there, replacing or absorbing more archaic populations. A center, a point of origin, a linear story. In May 2023, an international team of geneticists published a study in the journal Nature that fundamentally changes this picture. The team, which included researchers from McGill University in Montreal, modeled the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens using complete genomic data from indigenous African populations among the oldest known human lineages, notably the San peoples of South Africa and the Mende peoples of West Africa. They built thousands of possible evolutionary models and looked for the one that best fit the current genomic data. The single-source population model simply didn't hold up. It couldn't explain the distribution of genetic diversity they observed. The model that did hold up was one of at least two distinct African populations, geographically separated, evolving with their own particularities, but regularly meeting and interbreeding for hundreds of millennia. A network, a conversation, a river with multiple branches. The researchers called this the weakly structured stem model. In everyday language, the image of a braided river is perhaps more evocative. Several currents that split apart and merge back together, over and over, across an entire continent and across an immense span of time. Let that image settle in. Imagine Africa 250,000 years ago. There isn't just one group of proto-modern humans, there are several. Populations scattered in the forests of the Congo, on the plains of Kenya, on the coastlines of Morocco, in the arid savannas of Namibia, in the temperate valleys of Ethiopia. Each one lives in its own environment, adapts to its local pressures, develops its own specificities. Sometimes, during wet periods that open up corridors of vegetation across normally arid zones, these populations meet. They interbreed. Genes travel from one population to another, perhaps behaviors do too. Then conditions change, the corridors close, and the populations separate again. Each one walks away with a genome slightly different from what it was, enriched by a few variants from somewhere else. This cycle, separation, encounter, hybridization, separation, repeated for hundreds of millennia across a whole continent, produced something entirely unique, a species of exceptional genetic diversity, with adaptive capacities that neither pure isolation nor total interbreeding could have produced alone. Africa wasn't the cradle of a single human family. It was the classroom for an entire continent, where distinct populations learned from one another to the rhythm of the rains and the droughts, of open roads and closed borders. This discovery resolves a tension that had existed for years in the paleontological data. If Homo sapiens came from a single African population, you would expect to find the oldest fossils concentrated in one single region. But that isn't what we find. The Jebel Irhoud fossils are in Morocco. Homo kibish is in Ethiopia. Florisbad is in South Africa. Comparable behavioral traces appear simultaneously in regions vastly distant from one another. These fossils and these sites do not contradict one another. They complement each other. They are the footprints of different populations that were all part of the same great African network. And this network, this continental connectivity, is exactly what the other continents did not have. Homo erectus populations in Asia also lived in diverse environments, but they were separated by geographical barriers that were much harder to cross. Their exchange network, if it existed at all, was less dense, less regular, less continental. Innovation accumulated more slowly. Genetic diversity remained more limited. Africa had the size. Africa had the diversity of environments, and above all, Africa had the corridors. Those routes that geography and climate cyclically opened and closed, forcing populations to meet just often enough to exchange genes and ideas, but not often enough to merge into a single homogeneous mass. It was the perfect combination, not by design, by geology, by climatology, by pure probability. There is a Kenyan researcher, Frederick Manthi, who has worked for decades in the Turkana Basin. He has discovered several important fossils, participated in dozens of publications, and trained generations of Kenyan students in paleoanthropology. In an interview a few years ago, he said something that has stayed with me. He said, "The bones are in the land of my ancestors. When I find them, I don't just think about human evolution in general. I think about continuity. This continent has always been here. These people have always been here. That continuity. Africa as a place inhabited without interruption since the very origins. As the only place on Earth where the human chain was never broken from the very beginning. It is something the data confirms, yet words struggle to fully convey. Current African populations are not closer to the origins in some reductive sense. They are the heirs of an unbroken presence on the only continent where our species has always lived, where the thread was never cut. The braided river model is still young. Researchers are debating the number of populations involved, their precise locations, the exact timing of their encounters. Some models suggest 2 primary source populations, others suggest more. African genomic data is still underrepresented in major global databases. Most human genomic studies have been conducted on European, Asian, or American populations, not African ones. That is a gap several teams are actively working to close. Every new study on complete African genomes enriches the model, adds nuance, and sometimes complicates it. What does not change is the central conclusion. Human origin is not a point. It is a continent. It is not a moment. It is a duration. It is not a single population. It is a network. And that network, that conversation spanning hundreds of millennia between scattered African populations is the reason you are here tonight. The body is heavy now. The breathing is slower. A braided river somewhere in Africa is still flowing toward the sea. Its branches separate and rejoin as they always have, indifferent to the passing of time, to the memory of men, to the theories of researchers. The water carries on. That braided river eventually produced something that walked out of Africa, that crossed the globe, and that finds itself tonight in your body, lying in the dark, somewhere in the English-speaking world, listening to a story your cells already know. It is time to come back to you, to right now, to what all of this means tonight in your life. We have traveled a long way tonight. We started with Darwin in his study in 1871, looking at chimpanzees and gorillas and saying, we come from there, without proof, with a quiet confidence in the logic of the living world. We followed Dart and his box of fossils on a wedding morning in Johannesburg. We walked with Johansen through the heat of Hadar. We watched the earth tear itself apart along the rift. We lived in the mosaic landscapes with primates who didn't know they were becoming something new. We saw brains grow under the pressure of the unpredictable. We held the face of Jebel Irhoud, that Moroccan face over 300,000 years old, so incredibly close to our own. We traced the mitochondrial lineage all the way back to an African woman we all come from. We ate mussels by the ocean in a cave at Cape Agulhas while the world froze around us. We watched the Neanderthals fade away, not defeated, but diluted. And finally we saw that our origins are not a single point, but an entire continent. A braided river of African populations that met, mingled, separated, and found each other again over hundreds of millennia. That is the final piece of the puzzle. It isn't that Africa was perfect. It's that it was the only place to bring all the conditions together at the exact same time. The tectonics that fractured the landscape, the climate that oscillated relentlessly, the corridors that opened and closed, the populations that met just often enough, not a paradise. A crucible, a demanding, unstable place, generous in its diversity and brutal in its pressures. We are the children of that demand. There is a question you might ask yourself now, in this half-asleep moment. What is left of all this? Not in the fossils, not in the genomic data. In you tonight. African instability gave you boredom and curiosity, that inability to stay in the same routine for too long. That need for novelty that sometimes feels like a flaw, but is actually a survival strategy millions of years old. The mosaic landscape gave you versatility. That way of being reasonably good at a lot of things without being exceptional at just one, which is the trademark of evolutionary generalists. The nights in the coastal caves gave you a sense of the symbolic. That ability to attach meanings to objects, to gestures, to sounds, to build entire worlds out of abstractions. The African network gave you language as you practice it. That complex syntax, that ability to transmit not just information, but experience, emotion, stories, visions of things that don't yet exist. An African continuity gave you something harder to name. A feeling, perhaps. The intuition that you belong to something very long, that you are not a beginning, but a link. That someone preceded you, and someone will follow you. And that this chain reaches back further than any family memory, further than any national history, further than any civilization. All the way back to a woman gathering mussels by the sea 164,000 years ago while the world froze around her. All the way back to a child walking in the footprints of an adult in the Laetoli ash 3.5 million years ago. All the way back to a small creature in an African mosaic landscape who, one morning, made the choice, if you can call it a choice, to cross the edge of the trees. Before letting you drift off to sleep, I want to say one thing. This story, the story of human origins, is one of the most beautiful that science has ever given us. Not because it is simple, because it is true. Because it was pulled from the rock and from the DNA by men and women who spent their lives on their knees in the dust, sifting sediments in 100-degree heat, sequencing genomes in cold laboratories, questioning the certainties that everyone around them took for granted. Darwin writing his prediction without a single fossil. Dart holding the skull in his hands and knowing. Johansen spotting the bone fragment on a slope and saying, in a whisper, a hominid. Hublin double-checking the date of Jebel Irhoud because he couldn't believe what he was reading. These moments of recognition, of seeing something no one else had seen yet, are also African inheritances, the curiosity that refuses to be satisfied, the eye that keeps looking when it would be so much easier to just go back to camp. We do all of that every day, in infinitely more ordinary context, but with the exact same brain, that expensive brain shaped by the climatic oscillations of the African Pliocene that continues to look for patterns, to solve problems, to light up in the presence of novelty. There is a tradition in many African cultures and in many other cultures around the world, from evening gatherings to village storytellers before the days of electricity, a tradition of gathering in the dark around a fire or a table, or simply around a voice, and letting a story carry you somewhere before you sleep. It isn't entertainment, it is something much older. It is the way knowledge was passed down before writing, the way children learned who they were and where they came from, the way adults reminded themselves that they were part of something much larger than themselves. What you are doing tonight, listening to a voice in the dark before falling asleep, is perhaps one of the oldest things humans have ever done, far older than books, than cities, than nations, than languages as we know them. This habit goes back to fires around which people sat millennia ago, tens of millennia ago, perhaps even longer, and someone would tell a story, and the others would listen, and eyes would gently close on the final words. Whether you are listening from the United States, from the UK, from Canada, Australia, South Africa, or any other corner of the English-speaking world, know that tonight we all took the exact same journey, in the exact same language, back to the exact same place, back to Africa, back to the beginning. If you want to share where you're listening from, leave a comment. If you want this channel to continue, subscribe. There are other journeys waiting. But if you just want to close your eyes right now, that is exactly what you should do. There is a woman somewhere in Africa, 200 millennia ago. She doesn't know you exist. She couldn't possibly imagine it, a future she will never see. The cities, the airplanes, the languages, the books. The night you are lying in right now is just as impossible for her as it is for you to feel the wind on her skin, to see the sky she saw, to know the name she carried, and yet in every one of your cells, her mitochondria are working, her DNA is there. The echo of her life, inside your life, silent, unbroken, absolutely real. The night stretches between you like an impossible distance, and like no distance at all. You can let yourself go now. The journey is over for tonight. It began a very long time ago in a landscape no one remembers, and it continues in the breath you are taking right now, and in the one you will take next, and the one after that,